A flight attendant pinned the black CEO down and smashed his teen son against the cabin window until the glass shattered. 10 minutes later, the CEO drove the attendant's skull straight through the jagged edge. What happens next will leave you speechless. He pinned a father to his seat and smashed a baby into the glass, certain no one would rise against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the narrow cabin as Flight 217 of Skyloom Airlines leveled off at 30,000 feet. Overhead, bins hummed as they settled. The air was crisp with the sterile scent of pressurized oxygen and cold steel. Most passengers leaned into their headrests, flipping through in-flight magazines or closing their eyes for the routine journey ahead. Adrian Miles adjusted the small blanket over his infant son, Kalen, who nestled quietly in his arms. The child stirred slightly, his tiny fingers curling near Adrian's chest. Adrian whispered, "Shh, it's all right," gently swaying side to side, more out of habit than necessity. His tailored charcoal suit remained sharp even in the cramped seat, his polished shoes barely touching the carpeted floor beneath him. To everyone else, he looked like what he was, a composed executive, fully in control. But inside, his mind ticked through bullet points for the international conference ahead, contracts to sign, partnerships to seal, and the looming pressure of expanding Norvale enterprises across global markets. As Adrian's eyes scanned the cabin, he caught a flash of something peculiar, a glance too sharp, too long. Nolan Vayer, one of the flight attendants, stood stiffly near the galley, arms crossed over his Navy uniform. His jaw was locked, his gaze fixed not on the general aisle like his colleagues, but directly at Adrian. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment something cold passed between them. Nolan turned away, muttering under his breath as he grabbed a stack of plastic cups from the drawer. "Another suit with a crying kid. Just what we need," he hissed, barely audible. His hands moved with mechanical precision, but his shoulders were tight, his movements stiffer than those of the other crew members. Adrian blinked, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. He wasn't new to judgment. Years of climbing the corporate ladder had taught him how to spot contempt, even in silence. But this was different. There was no polite mask on Nolan's face, no effort to disguise the irritation, just open resentment. Adrian looked down at Kalen, whose breath had deepened into soft, rhythmic snores. "You're doing fine," Adrian whispered, though the unease in his stomach said otherwise. Across the aisle, a businessman tapped on a laptop. Further back, a teenage boy scribbled in a sketchpad. No one seemed to notice the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, how Nolan's eyes kept drifting back toward Adrian like a storm cloud stalking the sun. When Nolan finally began the beverage service, the other attendant, a quiet man named Jerome, took the lead. He greeted each row with a practiced smile, wheeling the cart smoothly past Adrian's seat. Nolan followed behind but didn't speak a word. When he reached Adrian's row, he paused just a fraction longer than necessary. "Coffee?" Jerome asked. Adrian nodded. "Yes, please." Jerome poured the drink steadily, but Nolan stood unmoving, glaring at the infant in Adrian's arms. Kalen stirred, lips smacking softly. A faint whimper escaped, followed by a low cry. Nolan's mouth twitched. "Figures," he muttered. Adrian looked up. "Excuse me?" "I said figures." "Every flight. It's always the same," Nolan replied too calmly. His voice held a sharp edge like a blade carefully wrapped in silk. Jerome glanced sideways, alarm flickering in his eyes. "Nolan!" "I'm just saying." Nolan cut him off, still staring at Adrian. "Some passengers think a suit and a baby give them a pass to disrupt everyone else's peace." Adrian stiffened. He wasn't a man who let words rattle him easily, but this felt targeted. He adjusted his grip on Kalen, who had now begun to cry in earnest. The sound was shrill, raw, and natural, the kind of cry no parent can plan around, no matter how powerful they are. "I'll take him to the back," Adrian offered, his tone neutral, his expression composed. Walking usually helps. He began to rise, careful not to disturb the passenger beside him, but Nolan stepped directly into the aisle, blocking his path. "No need," he said flatly. "You should have considered this before boarding." Adrian stopped, staring at the man's unblinking face. A hush fell over the nearby seats as tension rippled outward. No one spoke, but several people leaned slightly, sensing something off. Adrian remained calm, his voice measured. "With all due respect, I'm trying to keep things calm. Blocking me helps no one." "You're not special," Nolan replied, stepping closer. Just because you wear a suit doesn't mean you own the air. Adrian blinked slowly, choosing restraint. He could feel the other passengers watching. His instincts warned him. This wasn't a normal confrontation. Something deeper was festering behind Nolan's eyes, a bitterness that had little to do with Kalen's cries and everything to do with whatever this man thought Adrian represented. Jerome finally intervened, tugging gently at Nolan's arm. "Let him pass, Nolan. Let's keep things smooth." Nolan stepped back, barely. "Whatever," he muttered, brushing past them. But Adrian saw it, the clenched fists, the flicker of rage. Adrian moved toward the rear of the cabin, whispering softly to his son as he walked. Kalen's cries slowly lessened, comforted by his father's warmth and motion. Still, Adrian felt eyes on his back. He didn't need to look to know who it was. When he returned to his seat minutes later, Kalen dozing once again, the same passengers avoided his gaze. Only Jerome offered a brief nod of sympathy. Nolan was nowhere in sight. Adrian sank back into his seat, the cabin lights dimmed for cruise. The quiet should have felt like relief, but instead, it felt like the calm before something inevitable. His hand rested protectively on Kalen's back. In his gut, Adrian knew this flight would not end the way it began. Not because of turbulence, or weather, or engine trouble, because of a man whose hate had found its target at 30,000 feet. Adrian had no idea that the sky itself was about to become a battlefield. The moment Kalen's cry pierced the cabin air, it was as if a ripple of unease swept through the enclosed space. The baby's wail, sharp and unrelenting, sliced through the low hum of the aircraft engines and the quiet chatter of passengers like a blade. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others glanced up with polite curiosity, but one man reacted differently, violently, if only in his eyes. Nolan Veyer turned slowly, his jaw tightening. His eyes, already narrowed from earlier glances, now burned with something far more volatile. He stood near the galley, arms folded stiffly against his navy vest, and stared directly at Adrian Miles without blinking. The tension in his posture didn't match the polished badge on his chest, or the calm professionalism his uniform was supposed to represent. He moved down the aisle with calculated steps, his shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown. Stopping at Adrian's row, he leaned in just enough to make his presence invasive, but not enough to appear hostile to anyone watching. "Sir, you need to silence your child," Nolan said flatly, his voice low but sharp, like a blade wrapped in cloth. "You're disturbing other passengers." Adrian looked up, surprised by the tone more than the request. He adjusted Kalen gently in his arms, rocking the baby while keeping his voice calm. "He's just upset from the change in pressure." I was about to take him to the back to calm him down. Nolan didn't move. Instead, he stepped slightly forward, blocking the aisle with one foot and resting a hand on the seat edge beside Adrian. His smirk deepened. "You'll stay where you are." "Walking around with a crying baby isn't going to help." Adrian paused. The words weren't just about airline policy, they were about power. He recognized the look in Nolan's eyes, not of concern, but of control. He had seen it in boardrooms where weak men tried to assert themselves over stronger ones. But here, thousands of feet in the air, there was no boardroom, just a metal tube filled with strangers, tension, and one man with a grudge. "I think it will help," Adrian replied firmly, trying to shift forward, "and I believe I'm allowed to move about the cabin unless there's a safety issue." Nolan's body stiffened. "Don't test me, sir," he muttered, leaning closer so only Adrian could hear. "You executives think your suits and money make you untouchable. But up here, you're just another passenger who needs to be reminded who's really in charge." Adrian's breath caught, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that this was not a misunderstanding or a power trip. It was personal, deeply personal. Something in Nolan's demeanor had crossed a line, and Adrian felt the air shift around him. Kalen's cries grew louder, his tiny face red from the pressure and discomfort. Adrian gently rocked him, trying not to let the infant sense the growing storm. He glanced around the cabin. Passengers were watching now, some pretending not to, others clearly locked onto the scene with hesitant curiosity. But no one intervened. The silence was heavy, filled with the assumption that flight crew always knew best. Another attendant, a younger man named Marcus, peeked around the curtain separating the galley but hesitated. His eyes flicked between Nolan and Adrian before vanishing again behind the thin fabric. He wasn't going to help. Adrian kept his voice level. "My son is in pain. I'm trying to help him. You need to step aside." But Nolan stayed put. His smile was gone now, replaced by a quiet menace that flickered beneath the surface. "Maybe your type isn't used to being told no," Nolan whispered, his voice barely above the roar of the engine. "But someone's got to teach you that up here. It's not about who you are on the ground." The words struck like cold water. Adrian stared back, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something colder. He understood now. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about airline policy. This was about resentment, festering beneath a uniform, and it had found a target. The air between them thickened. Adrian adjusted Kalen again, the baby now hiccuping between cries, his little hands clinging to his father's shirt. Adrian's instincts sharpened, his mind cycling through options. He could stand and risk escalating things. He could call for help, but the crew seemed unwilling. Or he could wait, try to de-escalate, and pray Nolan's control didn't tip further into violence. But something in Nolan's stance, the clenched fist, the shallow breathing, the twitch at the corner of his eye, told Adrian that waiting might be the most dangerous move of all. Around them, the cabin grew tense. A man across the aisle whispered something to his seatmate. A teenager angled his phone subtly, perhaps beginning to record. But no one acted. No one spoke. The weight of silence became a character in itself, watchful, judging, complicit. Adrian's thoughts raced. He didn't care about ego or posturing. He cared about one thing, keeping his son safe. And something in Nolan's eyes told him that this wasn't going to end with a conversation. The moment cracked when Nolan muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for Adrian to hear, "Time. Someone showed you what real control looks like." Adrian's eyes met his. No anger, just understanding, the way a man reads the weather seconds before a storm breaks. He shifted slightly in his seat, bracing without making it obvious. Behind him, Kalen's cries softened for a moment, as if sensing his father's tension and absorbing it like a sponge. The hush in the cabin grew eerie, and then Nolan leaned back, the smirk returning like a shadow crawling across his face. The passengers said nothing. The crew did nothing. But Adrian knew something was coming. The baby's cry was no longer just a sound. It was a spark on dry timber. Nolan lunged. The flight attendant's body crashed into Adrian with bone-jarring force, slamming him flat against the cabin floor. The impact drove the air from Adrian's lungs in a choked gasp, his back colliding with the narrow aisle carpet that felt coarse and suffocating beneath him. Kalen's soft cries turned shrill as the baby jolted in Adrian's arms. Adrian's hands clenched tighter around his son, refusing to let go, his muscles screaming with strain. But Nolan moved with terrifying speed. "Give me the brat," he snarled, voice distorted with rage, eyes wild and unblinking. His hands, pale-knuckled and shaking, tore at Adrian's arms like claws. Before Adrian could lock his hold tighter, Nolan ripped Kalen from his grip with a final wrenching tug that felt like tearing bone from flesh. "No!" Adrian's voice cracked with panic, hoarse and primal. He reached out, fingers grasping at empty air. Nolan turned, clutching the infant like a sack of weightless cargo, and in a single horrific motion shoved Kalen toward the cabin window. The baby struck the pane with a dull, sickening thud. The sound cut through the cabin like a whip crack. The thin plastic panels around the window vibrated. A web of cracks burst across the double-layered glass, tiny splinters snaking outward with a sound like shattering ice. The interior pane held, but just barely. A low creak echoed as the fuselage shifted and the lights flickered. Passengers cried out. Some gasped, others whimpered, but no one moved. A businessman in a tan suit halfway down the aisle stood halfway up from his seat before hesitating, gripping the headrest in front of him. Another passenger, a heavy-set man in the window seat across from the chaos, reached for the overhead button, pressing it repeatedly, eyes wide and darting. None of them intervened. They were afraid of doing the wrong thing, afraid of breaking the unspoken law of obedience to uniformed crew. Adrian surged upward, the panic boiling into desperation. His shoulder rammed into Nolan's hip, knocking the man off balance for a moment, but Nolan recovered quickly, shoving Adrian back down with a brutal stomp to his chest. Adrian's head slammed against the armrest beside him, a sharp burst of pain blooming across his temple. Blood dripped, hot and sudden, down the side of his face, staining the collar of his shirt. He barely felt it. All he saw was his son, small, fragile, helpless, dangling inches from cracked glass that separated them from 30,000 feet of empty sky. "Back off!" Nolan barked, twisting to shield Kalen with one arm, pressing the child's tiny form closer to the window. "You think your money gives you power? Up here, I decide who matters." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with something far darker: bitterness, rage, obsession. Adrian coughed, struggling to sit up, blinking through the blood and haze. His vision tunneled on his son. Kalen whimpered, eyes shut, one small hand curled into his onesie. The cracked window creaked again. "Nolan, please," Adrian said, voice steadying with effort. "He's just a baby." "Let him go." Nolan didn't respond with words. He pressed Kalen's back against the fractured pane, his own fingers trembling at the pressure. The glass groaned beneath the weight, the outer seal bowing faintly outward with the cabin's pressurized air. Adrian's muscles burned as he pushed himself upright again, rage boiling beneath his skin, but he kept his voice low, controlled. "Don't do this. You don't want to be the reason a child dies." Step away from the window, Nolan's eyes flicked toward him, just for a second. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Fear, maybe, or madness, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "People like you never face consequences," Nolan whispered so quietly only Adrian could hear. "Up here, I make the rules." He shoved Kalen slightly harder against the pane. Another crack split across the window. Adrian's body responded before thought could catch up. He launched forward, ramming Nolan in the side with his full weight. Nolan stumbled, his balance breaking just enough for Adrian to snatch the baby from his hands, clutching him protectively against his chest. But Nolan wasn't finished. He roared, grabbing Adrian by the collar and slamming him down again. Adrian's back hit the floor with a thud. Kalen cried loudly now, shrill and scared, as Adrian twisted to shield him with his arms. The passengers were screaming now. Some pressed themselves against the cabin walls. A man shouted, "Do something!" But no one moved. The other flight attendants stood frozen by the service galley, horrified and paralyzed. Adrian's heart pounded like a drum inside his chest, fear and fury clashing in his blood. He tasted copper. His mind raced. No one was coming. He was alone. Alone against a man who had clearly lost his grip on sanity, who didn't care about rules or life or reason anymore, and the cabin was already one cracked pane away from disaster. Adrian glanced toward the window. The fractures had grown. The creak had turned into a faint whistle. A small line of air hissed from the upper seal. The entire wall of the plane seemed to flex with every vibration, every gust of turbulence. There was no time left. Adrian's thoughts narrowed into one truth: protect your son, at any cost. He locked eyes with Nolan, who was already crouching to lunge again. And in that suspended second, as the cabin lights shimmered and passengers wept and the wind whispered through the fractured seal, Adrian knew this was no longer about a business trip, no longer about titles or pride. This was about survival. The only rule left was this: one man would walk away, the other would not. The window creaked, threatening to give way with every breath of turbulence. Adrian twisted violently, breaking free from Nolan's grip with a guttural roar. The fabric of his dress shirt tore at the shoulder, threads ripping like the snap of dry branches. Sweat and blood clung to his skin, the collar of his shirt plastered against his neck as he lunged forward, arms outstretched. He caught Kalen just as the cabin window gave way. With a deafening crack, the weakened pane exploded inward, shards of tempered glass bursting into the aisle like a rain of blades. The cabin lights flickered as the aircraft lurched, rocked by sudden turbulence. A deafening howl of wind flooded the space, swallowing the collective scream of the passengers. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like ghostly vines, swinging wildly as the alarms screamed overhead. Adrian fell backward with his son wrapped tightly in his arms, curling protectively around the baby as he rolled to shield him from the flying debris. Thin cuts streaked across his arms and neck, but Kalen was safe, crying, terrified, but unharmed. That cry was all Adrian needed to hear. Across the aisle, Nolan straightened, his eyes wild, his hair tousled by the suctioning wind. His lips twisted into a feral grin. He didn't hesitate. He charged. Adrian barely had time to rise to one knee before Nolan crashed into him again, sending both men skidding along the blood-smeared floor. Trays and paper cups whipped by like missiles, pulled toward the jagged mouth of the broken window. Somewhere, a passenger sobbed into their hands. Others pressed back into their seats, pale-faced and frozen. Some clutched their phones, but no one dared to raise them. No one moved. "You think you're above the rules," Nolan growled, eyes fixed on the baby. His voice was a rasp, barely heard over the roar, but Adrian caught every word. "People like you always think the world owes you something." Adrian said nothing. His breathing was ragged. One arm wrapped tightly around Kalen's tiny frame while the other pushed against Nolan's shoulder, trying to create space. "You're not special," Nolan sneered, pressing down harder. "You're just a man, and men bleed." Adrian's mind flashed, not to boardrooms or conference calls, but to a dusty college gym. The sharp smell of sweat and tape, the sound of gloves hitting pads, the voice of his old coach barking, "Breathe, center, wait for the overcommit." This wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't even about pride. This was survival. "I don't care what you think of me," Adrian spat through clenched teeth, "but you will not hurt my son." With a sudden twist, Adrian shoved upward, using the angle of his elbow to strike Nolan under the chin. The move stunned the attendant, just long enough for Adrian to roll them sideways, gaining a sliver of control. His back slammed against the edge of a seat. The pain was sharp, but he ignored it. His only focus was keeping Kalen from being torn from his grasp again. Nolan came at him once more, clawing, grabbing at anything he could find. His fingers wrapped around the edge of Adrian's belt, trying to drag him closer to the fractured window where wind howled like a living beast. "Let go!" Adrian shouted, gritting his teeth as he fought Nolan's grip. He adjusted his weight, pressing Kalen against his chest, shielding him from the suction of air and the broken shards still clinging to the edge of the window frame. Suddenly, Nolan pulled back with both hands and lunged again. The force sent Adrian stumbling. They crashed into the galley wall with a thud that knocked the breath from Adrian's lungs. Pain bloomed across his back, but he stayed upright, planting his feet. Nolan's face was close now, eyes bloodshot, spit flying with every word. "I'll show them all," he hissed. "They think I'm nothing, but I'll show them what real control looks like." Another jolt rocked the plane. Overhead bins swung open, contents spilling into the aisle. The turbulence seemed to feed Nolan's frenzy. He grabbed for Kalen again, fingers brushing the edge of the baby's onesie. "No!" Adrian roared, shifting back with a violent snap of his shoulder. Nolan's fingers missed by inches. Passengers were screaming now. A man in a business suit shouted something unintelligible, while an older gentleman near the emergency exit clutched his seat, whispering prayers under his breath. But no one moved to help. They couldn't. Not while the scene before them played out like something from a nightmare. Nolan's expression twisted into something monstrous. "You think you can fight me?" he spat, his words barely audible beneath the shrieking alarms. "You're just another rich coward hiding behind a crying brat." Adrian's lip curled. "Try me." And then Nolan lunged again, this time with his entire weight behind the motion, aiming not for Adrian, but for Kalen. His hands stretched forward, fingers hooked like claws. Adrian stepped into the attack, not away from it, into it. The sudden shift caught Nolan off guard. Adrian's shoulder rammed into Nolan's chest, sending them both tumbling to the floor once more. Adrian grunted as he landed hard on his elbow, but he never let go of Kalen, not even for a second. Nolan's rage knew no limits. He scrambled back to his feet and let out a shout, part war cry, part madness, and leapt toward the cracked window. His hands reached for Adrian, for Kalen, for destruction. Air surged harder through the gap, the edges of the window now jagged and trembling. Cups, paper, a torn headset, everything flew toward the breach. Adrian could feel the pull, could hear the way the wind hissed through his ears like a warning. And still, Nolan came. Adrian's vision narrowed. His grip on Kalen tightened. His feet dug into the carpet. He knew he couldn't just block. He couldn't just defend. He had to end this. He crouched slightly, shifting Kalen to his dominant side, placing the baby against his ribs and away from danger. His free hand clenched into a fist. His back straightened. His mind cleared. He was no longer a CEO. He was no longer a passenger. He was a father. As Nolan surged forward with outstretched arms, Adrian waited, still and focused. "Now," his old coach would have said. "Now's your moment." Adrian stepped aside and twisted Nolan's body with a brutal redirection of force, guiding his momentum away from the child and toward the opposite wall. They crashed again, but this time Adrian stayed on his feet. Nolan stumbled back, gasping, bleeding, but far from done. He turned, face twisted in fury, and dove again, one final attempt to rip the baby from Adrian's arms and throw both of them toward the screaming wind. Adrian braced himself, thinking only of Kaelin, of the promise he once made to protect what mattered, no matter the cost. The cabin had become an arena, and survival was the only rule. Adrian gripped Nolan's wrist and twisted with all his might. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin like a snapped branch, Nolan's face contorting in pain as his hand jerked back. But he didn't scream. He didn't fall. Instead, Nolan's head snapped forward with brutal speed, crashing into Adrian's mouth with the force of a hammer. The collision split Adrian's lip wide open, hot blood flooding over his teeth and chin. The metallic taste overwhelmed his senses as he staggered back, clutching Kaelin tighter to his chest. The aisle became a battlefield. Trays clattered to the floor, a drink cart tipped and rolled sideways with a loud bang, spilling cutlery and unopened cans in a metallic rain. Passengers gasped and ducked. A few shouted for help. Some cried, yet not a single person moved to intervene. Adrian stumbled over a fallen thermos, his heel slipping on spilled juice, but he never let go of his son. His left arm shielded the infant like armor, while his right swung blindly, fueled by instinct and desperation. Nolan lunged again, hands curled into claws, eyes wide and unblinking like a man possessed. "You don't belong up here," Nolan hissed between breaths, voice shaking with hatred. "Men like you think you own the sky." Adrian didn't respond. There was no room for words, only survival. With a surge of strength, Adrian slammed Nolan sideways into a row of seats. The metal frame groaned. Nolan's shoulder collided with the armrest, but he recoiled fast, clawing like an animal toward the shattered window still hissing from the earlier impact. He seemed drawn to it, his gaze fixed on the broken glass as if it promised something only he understood. "Stay away from the window," Adrian shouted, shifting to block Nolan's path. "You're going to kill someone." Nolan ignored him. Instead, he dropped low, fingers scraping along the floor. A sound like glass against metal followed. Then he rose again, slowly, purposefully, clutching a jagged shard of window pane. The passengers froze. Time held its breath. The shard was long and wicked, curved at one end and gleaming in the overhead lights. A thin trail of blood ran down Nolan's forearm from earlier, dripping onto the floor and dotting the carpet like punctuation marks in a sentence written in rage. Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to get Kaelin away. But there was nowhere to go. He backed down the aisle, keeping himself between the shard and his son. Nolan raised the weapon with a sick smile. "Let's see how much your money helps you now." Behind them, oxygen masks still dangled, swaying with every jolt of turbulence. The cabin lights flickered once, casting the plane in brief shadow, and then returned, harsh and unforgiving. Adrian stepped backward again, his feet crunching on glass. "Put it down," he said, voice low but firm. "You're done." "It's over." Nolan shook his head slowly. "It's never over for people like me." "You think this ends with me getting fired?" "Number. This ends with justice." "For who?" Adrian asked, tightening his grip on Kaelin, whose tiny body trembled in his arms. "You attacked an infant." Nolan's grin vanished, his eyes narrowing. "Collateral." Then he lunged. The shard slashed through the air with a sickening whoosh, missing Adrian's face by inches and tearing into the cushion of the nearest seat. Foam and fabric burst out like smoke from a wound. Adrian turned his shoulder, presenting his back to protect Kaelin, even as the sharp edge glanced off his ribs, slicing through his shirt and drawing a fresh line of blood. He cried out but didn't fall. Nolan pulled back for another swing, faster this time, reckless and wild. Adrian ducked, then twisted away, the shard narrowly missing Kaelin's head. The cabin descended into chaos. Several passengers screamed. A man near the front shouted, "Stop him!" "Someone help!" But no one moved. Even the remaining crew members stood frozen, their eyes locked on the impossible horror playing out before them. Adrian's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He couldn't keep dodging forever. The space was too tight, and Nolan too desperate. He had to end it, fast. He scanned Nolan's stance, looking for an opening. Then he saw it. Nolan's weight shifted too far forward during his swings. He was overcommitting, leading with his shoulder instead of his hips. Sloppy, dangerous, predictable. Adrian waited. Blood dripped from his lip onto Kaelin's forehead. Nolan raised the shard again. "Let's end this." Adrian didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply stepped to the side, allowing Nolan's momentum to carry through. As Nolan lunged, Adrian caught his arm and twisted. The shard clattered to the floor. Gasps erupted. Nolan howled, reeling from the sudden reversal, and Adrian shoved him backward into the seats again. The lights glinted off the shard where it now lay beside a food tray, untouched and forgotten by its wielder. Adrian didn't relax. He stayed poised, every muscle coiled, shielding Kalen with his frame. He knew Nolan wasn't done, not yet, but the threat had changed. The weapon was gone, yes, but the madness wasn't. Nolan stared down at his empty hands, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. The passengers watched silently, terrified to speak, to move, to breathe. And in that stillness, the shard caught the cabin lights, gleaming like a promise of blood. The shard sliced through the air with a sharp whistle, missing Adrian's face by mere inches. It tore into the seat cushion behind him with a soft thump and a hiss, like a serpent striking and burrowing deep. Stuffing puffed out of the gash, floating for a moment before the rushing cabin air scattered it like dandelion seeds in a storm. Passengers shrieked, ducking low behind their tray tables and seatbacks, eyes wide and lips trembling. One man in a gray business suit covered his head with a laptop bag. Another, a teenager in headphones, yanked the cord from his ears and stared in horror. The terror was no longer contained. It pulsed through the cabin like electricity, tangible and inescapable. Adrian didn't flinch, though his heart pounded so violently he could hear it in his ears. Every muscle in his body ached from tension, and the cut on his temple throbbed in rhythm with the pulsing lights overhead. He shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on Kalen, whose sobs had turned into small, hiccuping gasps. The baby's face was buried in his father's chest, his tiny hands clutching at Adrian's torn shirt. Adrian's arms cradled him tightly, protectively, never letting go for even a second. Nolan, crouched just a few feet away, was grinning. His teeth were stained with blood, one of them chipped from the earlier struggle, and his breath came out in sharp, ragged bursts. The shard of glass in his hand caught the dim, overhead lights, casting cruel reflections across the cabin walls. "Not so calm now, are we?" Nolan sneered, eyes gleaming with a manic glint. "You executives hide behind titles, behind bodyguards. But up here?" He spread his arms wide for a moment, almost theatrically, before taking another step forward. "Up here, you break like anyone else." Adrian didn't respond. Words would be wasted now. His focus narrowed, like a camera lens tightening on a single moment. Every detail, the shard, Nolan's posture, the slickness of the floor from spilled coffee, the distance between them, etched itself into his mind with clarity. He knew he couldn't fight recklessly. One wrong move could send that shard plunging into his son's soft skin. His body twisted slightly to the side, always keeping Kalen away from the threat, always shielding him even at the cost of his own safety. A line of blood trickled down his cheek from an earlier cut, tracing a slow path toward his jaw. Nolan took another step, his stance now more calculated, like a predator circling a wounded target. The glass trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I could end this right now," he muttered. "One swing. You wouldn't be able to stop me." Adrian's voice, when it came, was calm and low. "Then do it." The words startled Nolan. His brow furrowed, the grin faltering for just a beat. "You think I'm bluffing?" "I think you're unraveling," Adrian said, eyes locked onto his attacker. "And I think you've already lost. You just don't know it yet." Nolan's snarl returned, and with a growl he raised the shard again, knuckles white with pressure. Adrian tensed, his legs shifting subtly for balance. He wasn't relying on brute strength. No, that would get him killed in these narrow, unstable conditions. He was waiting for a mistake, a swing too wide, a step too long. He remembered a maneuver from his college boxing days, one his coach had drilled into him until it became muscle memory. Redirect. Don't resist. Let the aggressor move into your control. Adrian's thoughts slowed, tuning out the screams, the shaking floor, the chaos around him. Nolan lunged. Adrian pivoted. With the shard slicing toward him, Adrian bent his knees, sidestepped just enough, and caught Nolan's wrist as it passed. The movement was clean, precise, less a block than a redirection. Using Nolan's momentum, he twisted the arm downward, forcing the shard to miss both himself and Kalen by a narrow margin. Nolan let out a strangled cry as his wrist bent backward. The glass shard clattered to the floor, spinning like a coin before settling under the emergency lighting. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. But the moment wasn't over. Nolan, wild and furious, didn't hesitate. He slammed his body into Adrian, driving them both into the nearest galley wall. The metallic thud echoed down the aisle, and a tray of utensils rained down beside them. Adrian grunted, pain surging through his ribs, but he kept hold of Kaelin, even as the infant cried out in fright. He tightened his grip, using his back to absorb the brunt of the blow. "You don't get to win," Nolan hissed. "You don't!" Adrian's mind screamed for him to finish it, but the conditions were still too dangerous. If he overcommitted, he'd risk exposing Kaelin to another attack. Nolan was still dangerous, and the glint in his eyes showed no signs of retreat. A distant cry rose from one of the passengers, a plea for someone to intervene, but still no one came. Phones recorded from trembling hands. Faces peeked over seats, unable to look away. Adrian knew he had to end it himself, but not with rage, with precision. He backed a step, lowering his center of gravity. Nolan lunged again, bare fists swinging. Adrian deflected the first punch with his forearm, guiding it past his head. The second grazed his side, but he absorbed it, rotating with the force. They were close now. Too close. The heat from Nolan's breath, the stench of blood and panic, the tremble of turbulence beneath their feet, it all collided in one storm of violence. But Adrian held steady. He was waiting for Nolan's desperation to turn into recklessness, waiting for the final mistake. Every second stretched like an hour as the shard gleamed closer to his son's fragile skin. Nolan lunged. With a guttural yell, he hurled himself at Adrian. The jagged shard aimed directly at the center of the CEO's chest. The glint of cabin lights danced along the blade's edge, a cruel sliver of metal seeking flesh. But Adrian, running on instinct and sheer terror, shifted his stance just in time. His body twisted sideways, shoulder rolling back as he caught Nolan's wrist mid-swing. A loud crack echoed through the cabin as Adrian's grip tightened, twisting with every ounce of practiced muscle memory. The shard clattered across the aisle, spinning under seats before vanishing beneath a row of passengers who flinched away in silence. For a moment, just a moment, the tension snapped like a stretched wire. Gasps rippled down the fuselage. A whisper of hope stirred. But Nolan didn't pause. With eyes wide and lips curled into something between a snarl and a grin, he slammed into Adrian once again, catching him off balance. The two men crashed sideways into the metal beverage cart, the full weight of their bodies crumpling the thin steel. The impact sent trays flying and toppled a half-open carafe of coffee. Scalding liquid burst free in a steaming arc, sloshing across the floor and over Adrian's exposed arm. Adrian screamed, not out of fear, but from searing pain. His skin burned, an instant welt rising under the soaked fabric of his shirt. But his grip on Kaelin never loosened. Even through the agony, he curled his body protectively, shielding his infant son from both the heat and the chaos. "Let go!" Nolan barked, voice hoarse and ragged, reaching again for the child. His movements were erratic now, driven by something deeper than anger, an obsession, maybe even madness. His pupils were pinpoints, his breath sharp and fast. Adrian backed against the cart, one arm cradling Kaelin, the other stretched defensively. The heat still clung to his forearm like invisible fire, and yet his focus never wavered. He scanned the floor for danger and spotted it instantly. A steel thermos lay near Nolan's boot. Nolan's eyes darted downward at the same time. He snatched the thermos in a blur, raising it overhead like a weapon. The polished metal gleamed, curved and heavy, trembling in his grip. Designed to serve tea or coffee, it now looked like something forged for war. "You think your title protects you?" Nolan hissed. "Up here, there's no boardroom. Just gravity and bones." Adrian didn't reply. Words would waste time. His mind raced, calculating angles, leverage, timing. He shifted his weight, keeping Kaelin nestled tightly against his chest, the baby's cries muffled now beneath layers of fear and fatigue. Nolan swung. The thermos whistled through the air, crashing into the beverage cart. The dented metal shrieked, sparks flying as the force split the panel open. A nearby passenger screamed. Another ducked down, hands over his head. All around them, phones remained frozen in laps. No one dared lift a lens. Not now, not when the violence was so real, so close. Adrian ducked and rolled, his knee colliding with Nolan's shin, throwing the flight attendant off balance. The thermos swung again, barely missing Adrian's head this time. It struck the wall beside the emergency exit with a deep, hollow clang. Panting, Adrian looked up. He saw sweat dripping down Nolan's forehead, blending with blood from a shallow cut above his eye. He was unrelenting, every inch of him charged with menace. And yet Adrian didn't falter. In the blur of motion, he remembered something his late brother once told him during a sparring session in their old garage. Don't meet brute force with more force. Redirect it, make it trip over its own weight. That memory flared like a beacon. Adrian let his body relax just slightly, drawing Nolan in, baiting the next strike. "You think you're strong enough to finish this?" Adrian said through clenched teeth, his voice low, steady. "Stronger than you ever were," Nolan spat. Another swing, another dodge. The thermos scraped Adrian's shoulder but didn't land cleanly. Pain flared, but it was manageable. He stayed upright. More importantly, he kept Kalen safe. The cartwheels beneath them jerked and rolled an inch, shifting the balance between both men. Adrian used it. He stomped down, stopping the cart. Then he turned, using the handlebar for leverage. With his free hand, he struck Nolan across the jaw, not with rage, but with purpose. A clean, tight punch honed by years of long-forgotten training. Nolan staggered, but still didn't fall. Instead, he let out a guttural growl, dragging the thermos back with both hands, prepared for one final strike. Adrian's eyes narrowed. His objective was no longer just about fighting back, it was about survival, about ending this. The cabin felt tighter now, air thicker. The overhead lights flickered once, turbulence pressing faintly beneath their feet. The cries of passengers were distant, blurred like echoes in a dream. But Adrian heard one sound clearer than all the rest. Kalen's heartbeat, rapid, frantic, alive. That was all the fuel he needed. He pushed Nolan back against the cart with his entire frame. The force knocked the thermos loose, it spun out of Nolan's grip and slid beneath a row of seats, disappearing from sight. For the first time, Nolan's confidence cracked. Adrian seized the moment. He shoved Nolan hard, using the side of his injured arm despite the pain, sending the man stumbling back toward the aisle. Trays crunched under his shoes. Coffee pooled beneath his heels. "You don't touch my son," Adrian growled, voice deeper now, rougher. Nolan opened his mouth, whether to retort or roar, Adrian never found out. The cart rolled again behind them, its wheels shrieking in protest, metal scraping along the floor. And through it all, Adrian stood firm, one arm burning, the other holding tight to the only life that mattered. The cart wheels screeched as though the plane itself cried out for justice. He thought broken windows would hide his cruelty, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Nolan lunged again. His body twisted with startling speed as he tore away from Adrian's grip and lunged not toward his opponent but toward the shattered cabin window. Adrian barely had a second to react before the realization hit. He's trying to pull us both through it. The suction from the fractured pane intensified in an instant. A roaring wind that screamed through the cabin like a beast unchained. Loose napkins, plastic cups, and an abandoned boarding pass flew into the air, sucked toward the broken glass with terrifying force. Passengers cried out, some ducking, others clinging to their seats, knuckles pale with fear. Overhead, the oxygen masks jerked and swayed like pendulums in a gale, their plastic shells knocking hollowly against the walls of the aircraft. Adrian tightened his arms around Kalen, who let out a sharp wail, his tiny body pressed hard against his father's chest. The sound pierced through the chaos like a flare of desperation. Adrian's mind screamed one thing: protect him. Everything else, the noise, the pain, the blood in his mouth, faded into the background. Nolan's hands clawed forward like hooks, catching Adrian by the collar and dragging both father and son backward, inch by terrible inch, toward the gaping wound in the fuselage. His eyes gleamed with something beyond rage, something feral and unhinged. His lips pulled back into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see how much you're willing to lose," Nolan growled, his voice barely audible over the shrieking wind. Adrian dug his heels into the carpet, his shoes catching against the floor with desperate friction. Muscles trembled. Sweat poured down his temples, mixing with the drying blood along his cheek. He gritted his teeth, shifting his weight backward, anchoring himself against the pull. Nolan's fingers snatched at Kalen's tiny legs. "Get your hands off him," Adrian bellowed, twisting his body sideways, shielding his son with his entire frame. Nolan didn't flinch. "You executives think everything bends for you," he hissed. "Well, let's see if gravity obeys your orders too." Adrian's mind spun. The broken window was no longer just a rupture in the aircraft, it was a razor-lined mouth ready to devour them all. The pressure difference, the jagged glass, the wind, all of it a trap just waiting for a single misstep. He shifted again, tightening his hold on Kalen with one arm while using the other to drive his elbow into Nolan's side. The hit connected, but Nolan only grunted and doubled down, forcing Adrian's upper body closer to the window's edge. Adrian's scalp tingled as the cold wind kissed the back of his head, each breath carrying the scent of steel and blood. A tray rolled past them, lifted by the current and flung across the cabin with a clang. Passengers screamed again. Somewhere to their left, a man shouted for help, but no one came closer. The fear in the cabin was paralyzing. Adrian's pulse thundered in his ears. Every second that passed was a second closer to disaster. He remembered something. An image, distant but clear. His brother's hand on his shoulder years ago, just after their father's funeral. The vow had been simple but powerful. You protect your own, no matter the cost. His brother was gone now, buried in silence, but the promise remained, etched into his bones like a commandment. That memory returned with clarity as Adrian looked down at Kalen's terrified eyes. I won't fail you, he thought. I won't let him win. You don't scare me, Adrian muttered through clenched teeth. Nolan sneered. You should be scared. Because the sky doesn't care how much money you have. With a surge of strength born of fear and fury, Nolan forced Adrian's upper back closer to the glass, his shoulder blades scraping the fractured frame. The edge caught the fabric of Adrian's suit, slicing it clean. Cold air clawed at his exposed skin. The sound of the cracking pane groaned louder. Adrian shifted his grip, repositioning Kalen higher against his chest. His free hand searched the floor, groping for anything that could give him leverage. His fingers closed around a torn seatbelt strap half-wedged beneath the seat. He yanked it with everything he had, winding it once around his palm and bracing it against the leg of the beverage cart behind him. His body jerked violently as Nolan tried to rip him forward again, but the strap held. You won't take him, Adrian spat. Nolan didn't answer. He only growled and lunged again, this time with both hands on Adrian's shoulders, pushing with all his weight. Adrian gasped as his spine bent back, the window frame's cold metal pressing against his skull. The pressure was unbearable. Adrian could feel the sharpness biting into his scalp. His neck muscles screamed. Kalen sobbed louder, his tiny fingers digging into Adrian's chest. Then something shifted. Something inside Adrian. A line had been crossed. He stopped pulling. He stopped defending. He started pushing back. The clarity came all at once. This ends now. His grip tightened. The muscles in his legs fired. His free arm swung around, locking Nolan's wrist and yanking it downward with a snap. Nolan cried out, loosening just enough for Adrian to shift his weight. Their positions reversed in a single fluid motion. Adrian's back slid away from the window, and Nolan's skull replaced it. Wind roared louder, like a scream of protest from the heavens themselves. Adrian pressed forward, face inches from his enemies, voice low and cold. You threatened my son, he said. Now the sky gets its answer. With a final heave of every ounce of strength he had left, Adrian forced Nolan's head toward the edge. And there it was. The edge glistened, a razor waiting to carve destiny into flesh. Adrian twisted Nolan's wrist with a force that wasn't just physical, it was instinctive, desperate, and driven by something primal. The moment Nolan's grip loosened, a surge of strength surged through Adrian's core. He reversed their positions in one fluid, brutal motion. Now it was Nolan whose body bent backwards, his head dangerously close to the jagged edges of the fractured window. The howling wind outside screamed through the narrow breach, rattling the overhead bins and sending thin streams of oxygen-scented air spiraling through the cabin. Loose napkins and plastic wrappers danced through the aisle like warning flags. Nolan's eyes widened, not with fear, but with disbelief. He kicked against the floor, clawing at Adrian's arms, spitting curses through blood-stained lips. But Adrian didn't waver. His legs were rooted, his back straight despite the pain burning through his shoulder and spine. One arm clutched baby Kalen close to his chest, the other locked around Nolan's neck in a crushing grip. Let me go, Nolan choked, his voice fraying beneath Adrian's pressure. You don't know what you're doing. But Adrian did. He knew exactly what this moment meant. This wasn't a fight between two men. It was a father's stand against the nightmare that had nearly taken his son. His eyes, bloodshot and focused, never left the window's jagged edge. He didn't need to look at Nolan anymore. He could feel the madness in the man's body, the twitching, the resistance, the refusal to surrender. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, silent, their faces pale with terror and awe. Some covered their mouths. A few had tears streaming down their cheeks. Phones that had once been gripped tightly in trembling hands now hung loose, forgotten. The battle wasn't being recorded anymore. It was being etched into memory, raw, terrifying, unforgettable. Kaelin cried in Adrian's arms, the sound soft but urgent, a rising wail against the roaring wind. It pierced through Adrian's daze like a beacon. He leaned his head just slightly, whispering without sound, his lips barely moving. "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." Nolan jerked suddenly, thrusting his knee upward in a desperate attempt to break free. It landed hard against Adrian's thigh, nearly buckling his stance. Pain shot up Adrian's leg, but he didn't release. Instead, he shifted, adjusting his weight, using Nolan's momentum against him, just as his old boxing coach had taught him over a decade ago. "Control is the absence of fear," the voice echoed in his mind. "Make the other man fear you more than the pain he can cause." Nolan's struggle weakened. His breath came in ragged gasps, his kicks becoming erratic, his balance faltering. Yet still his eyes burned with hatred. "You don't belong up here," he hissed. "You think money makes you safe?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "No," he said coldly. "But love does." And with that, he pushed. It wasn't a savage slam. It was measured, deliberate, final. Nolan's skull struck the broken edge of the window with a chilling crack. The sound was sharp and distinct, rising above the chaos like a judge's gavel striking down a verdict. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to halt. The vibrations echoed through Adrian's arms, through the aluminum of the aircraft, through the trembling souls of everyone on board. Then came the blood. A sudden, vivid spray, a crimson arc flung across the nearby seats and cabin wall. Nolan's body twitched violently once, then sagged. His eyes, wide with shock, began to lose focus. His hands, those same hands that had once clawed at a baby, now fell limp at his sides. His head slumped forward, streaks of blood tracing lines down the seat and floor. Silence claimed the cabin. Adrian didn't move right away. He stood there, holding Kaelin tightly against his chest, his own body shivering with adrenaline and exhaustion. His heart pounded in his ears, deafening and rhythmic, each beat louder than the last. The child whimpered softly, but he was alive and safe. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled blazer slowly lowered his hands from his face. Another passenger, a young male, perhaps a student, stared at Adrian as though watching a myth unfold. Even the remaining flight crew stayed back, stunned and pale, unsure if what they had just witnessed was justice or something beyond it. Adrian finally took a step back, knees threatening to buckle. He pressed his forehead gently to Kaelin's, feeling the warmth of his son's skin, the rise and fall of his tiny chest. His free hand trembled as it hovered over the baby's head, not quite knowing whether to protect, comfort, or simply reassure himself that it was real. The wind outside still roared through the broken seal, but it was quieter now, less threatening, more like the exhale of a storm spent. Shards of glass still glittered on the floor. Blood still pooled beneath the lifeless man. But the chaos, for now, had ended. And somewhere in the back of the cabin, someone whispered, "He saved him." He actually saved him. Adrian didn't speak. He didn't nod. He didn't claim heroism. He just stood, broken, bloodied, and holding his child, while the reality of what had just happened settled into the bones of every man aboard. He hadn't come looking for this fight, but he had finished it, and in that stillness, only one truth remained. The battle was over, but the war for truth had only just begun. The sound of Nolan's skull hitting the shattered edge still hung in the air like a thunderclap long after it ended. Blood spattered the nearby seatbacks, a red smear across the sterile white of the aircraft's interior. For one breathless moment, the entire cabin was still. No crying, no yelling, no announcements. Just silence. A thick, suffocating silence broken only by the low hum of the engines and the soft, sinister hiss of air seeping through the fractured window where the violence had reached its brutal climax. Adrian stood over Nolan's crumpled body, his breath ragged, chest heaving as sweat mixed with blood across his brow. His arms trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of holding his son, Kaelin, close. The infant clung to his shirt instinctively, face buried in his father's shoulder, his tiny body shaking from the trauma, though he could not understand it. Adrian could feel the rapid flutter of his son's heartbeat against his own, a fragile rhythm that reminded him of why he had fought so fiercely. The protective instinct still roared through him, even as his limbs grew heavy. He took a single step back, his foot slipping slightly on a streak of coffee and blood that had pooled along the aisle. He caught himself against the edge of a seat and lowered himself slowly, easing into a crouch beside the row, his back pressed to the wall. Kaylin's breathing was fast but steady. He wasn't bleeding, thank God, but the tears hadn't stopped. Adrian pressed a kiss to his son's temple, voice raw and barely audible. "You're safe, son. I've got you. I've got you," he whispered, though part of him didn't believe it. Around them, the cabin came back to life like a movie unpaused. A man in a gray suit stumbled forward from row 12, his phone held shakily in his hand, its camera blinking red. A young boy 2 rows down began crying again, this time in fear rather than sympathy. An elderly man murmured a prayer under his breath, the words trembling with gratitude and disbelief. 2 flight attendants, both male, both visibly shaken, crept toward the shattered window, their steps hesitant. One carried a roll of duct tape and a blanket, the other just clutched a first aid kit to his chest like a shield. They didn't look at Nolan. They didn't even look at Adrian. Their eyes darted everywhere else, scanning for something familiar, something normal. Adrian turned his head, following their movement, the fog in his mind lifting just enough for instinct to return. "Seal it. Use the blankets. Don't wait for instructions," he called out, his voice hoarse but commanding. The younger of the 2 attendants startled at the sound, but nodded. Yes, sir," he stammered, moving faster now. The rush of air was steady but controlled. The crack hadn't turned into a full breach, but the cabin pressure was unstable. As they worked quickly to seal off the opening with layered fabric and silver tape, Adrian rested his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for just a moment. Pain pulsed in waves from his shoulder, his jaw, his scorched forearm. Every breath came with effort. He'd never felt so tired. But sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not here. Not with Kaylin's soft whimper still echoing in his ear. He opened his eyes again, scanning the faces around him. Some were sobbing. Others stared in disbelief. A few had started recording, lifting their phones and shaking hands. And still others looked away, unwilling or unable to process what they had witnessed. A man from row 8 knelt beside him, his voice low. Is he dead?" Adrian didn't answer at first. He looked toward Nolan's twisted form, sprawled face down, limbs slack, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth onto the aluminum floor. "I don't know," Adrian said finally, "but he won't hurt anyone again." The man nodded once, backing away without another word. Adrian didn't blame him. What was there to say? Somewhere near the back of the plane, someone called for help. "Is there a doctor on board? Anyone medical?" No answer came. The intercom remained silent. Either the pilot didn't know what had happened or didn't want to say anything yet. Adrian suspected the latter. He shifted Kaylin in his arms, careful not to jostle the baby's head. The child had stopped crying but wasn't asleep, just staring ahead, eyes glassy and unblinking. Adrian knew that look. Shock. The kind that didn't fade easily. The kind that left invisible bruises long after the bleeding stopped. A crew member finally approached him, middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing a badge that read Samuel. He crouched beside Adrian, his voice quiet, unsure. "We've contacted the cockpit. They're beginning descent. Emergency landing, estimated 20 minutes. Medics will be waiting." Adrian nodded, every muscle screaming. "Thank you." Samuel paused. "You saved us, sir. Everyone." That man was. He lost control. Adrian's eyes flicked toward Nolan again. He didn't just lose control. He had none to begin with. Samuel didn't reply. Instead, he rose and returned to the other crew members, all of them now working with mechanical speed, cleaning, covering, patching, as though their bodies had taken over where their minds had stopped. Adrian remained where he was, cradling his son. A drop of blood tickled the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away with his sleeve, his thoughts spinning. How had it come to this? A routine flight, a conference waiting on the other side, a future meant to be built. And now, a broken window, a shattered illusion, and a child whose innocence had been thrown into chaos at 30,000 feet. Someone touched his shoulder gently. Another male passenger, maybe mid-40s, brown-haired, glasses. "Do you want water?" Or anything. Adrian gave him a faint smile, shaking his head. "Just space." The man nodded and stepped away. Minutes passed in silence, but time no longer moved the way it should. It warped, dragged, curled around the pain in his limbs and the fire behind his eyes. Kalen blinked once, then twice, finally resting his cheek again against Adrian's chest. And then, softly, barely above a whisper, Adrian spoke again. "It's over now, little man. You're safe." But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crept into his heart. He looked around the cabin once more, not at Nolan, not at the shattered window, not at the crimson stains on his knuckles. He looked at the people, the bystanders, the frozen mouths, the hesitant hands, the silence that had followed the first scream. He saw it all with new clarity. No one had helped, and that truth weighed heavier than any bruise on his body. He swallowed hard, tightened his grip on his son, and whispered again, this time only to himself. The father's strength had saved the child, but it had also broken the world's illusion of safety. The plane jolted violently as it descended through thick, turbulent clouds. Red emergency lights pulsed across the cabin, casting everything in an eerie, flickering glow. The oxygen masks swung like pendulums above the heads of terrified passengers, some dangling loose, others gripped in trembling hands. Alarms blared and cut out in stuttering bursts, creating a haunting chorus of distress. The damaged cabin creaked under pressure, a metallic groan rising from the fuselage as if the aircraft itself struggled to hold together. Adrian Miles sat hunched in his seat, his left arm wrapped tightly around his son, Kalen. Blood had dried in patches along his temple, forming a jagged line that trailed down his jaw. His shirt, torn and soaked in sweat, clung to his chest. With every descent of the aircraft, his spine felt as if it might snap from the strain. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained forward, locked on the seat ahead, as though his stillness alone could keep the plane from falling apart. Kalen whimpered softly, his small fingers clinging to Adrian's collar with instinctive desperation. Adrian lowered his head, pressing his lips to his son's forehead. "We're almost there, son," he whispered, the words more for himself than the child. His voice trembled, but his hold was steady. "I've got you." All around him, passengers sat frozen. Some sobbed quietly behind their hands. Others clutched at armrests, eyes squeezed shut, knuckles white. A middle-aged man 2 rows up muttered a prayer through chattering teeth. A teenage boy stared wide-eyed at the shattered window, still covered with a quick patch of tape and a flight blanket that flapped against the pressure of rushing air. In the aisle, the remaining flight attendants scrambled to maintain calm. One of them, Kirk, a wiry man in his 40s, fumbled with the intercom. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, please brace for emergency landing. Emergency crews are on standby. Remain seated. Remain calm." The plane groaned again, banking slightly. Adrian's stomach lurched with the angle, but he adjusted his grip, anchoring his feet under the seat in front of him. His right forearm burned from the earlier scald, and every breath sent a lance of pain through his ribs. Yet he remained a rock for Kalen, shielding him from the chaos. He wasn't thinking like a CEO anymore. He wasn't thinking about his company or the global deal waiting for him at the conference. Right now, he was only a father, and his only objective was survival. Suddenly, the landing gear slammed open beneath them with a deafening thud. The sound drew gasps from several passengers. One man screamed. Another clutched his chest, eyes rolling back until a neighbor reached over, shaking him violently to keep him conscious. Then came the descent. The runway rose fast in the windows. The wheels hit the tarmac with a shattering screech. The entire aircraft shuddered, bouncing once before settling into a skidding roar. Sparks erupted beneath the wings as brakes strained to slow the massive weight. Adrian's head snapped forward, then back, the seatbelt biting into his shoulders. Kalen cried out, but the sound was drowned in the chorus of metal, rubber, and wind. The plane finally slowed. The engines whined into silence. A stillness settled, as heavy as the storm that had just passed. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused to catch its breath. Then the sirens began. Through the windows, red and blue lights flashed. Emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, security jeeps raced toward the aircraft. The bright beams reflected off the streaks of blood and shattered glass still scattered across the cabin. A loud click sounded near the front as the emergency doors opened. A blast of humid air filled the cabin as inflatable stairs deployed with a hiss. "Help is here," Kirk shouted, waving toward the front. "Everyone stay seated until instructed." Medics in full gear rushed aboard, pushing past stunned passengers. Their eyes widened when they saw Adrian. Blood streaked down the side of his face, his clothes torn, a limp infant in his arms. "You there, are you the father?" one of the paramedics asked, crouching beside him. Adrian nodded but didn't release his grip. "We need to check the baby, please," the man said, softer this time. His hands were gentle, gloved and precise. Another medic beside him opened a portable scanner and oxygen mask. Adrian hesitated. His arms refused to let go, even as his mind knew he must. Slowly, he handed Kalen over, watching every movement as the medics examined the child. "He's breathing." "Strong heartbeat," one of them reported. "Minor bruising, but no serious trauma. We've got him." Relief swept over Adrian like a crashing tide, and with it came a new ache, deeper than any wound. The kind that came from fear, from fury, from the weight of knowing how close he had come to losing everything. Behind them, 2 more responders approached with a stretcher. Between them, they carried the body of Nolan Vayer, now hidden beneath a thick, blood-soaked blanket. One of the men looked away as they passed, his jaw clenched tight. Another officer stepped up, clipboard in hand, but paused when he saw Adrian try to stand. "Sir, please don't move. You're hurt." "I'll stand," Adrian said, teeth clenched. His voice was hoarse but resolute. "I'm not leaving this cabin on a stretcher." "But your arm, your side," the officer protested. "I said I'll walk," Adrian repeated, lifting himself with effort. Pain shot through his body like fire, but he welcomed it. It made him feel alive. It reminded him of what he had endured, and of what came next. He straightened his back, stepping forward with slow, deliberate strides. Passengers stared, some reaching out to touch his arm in gratitude or shock. A few murmured thanks. Others simply wept. He paused once more before exiting the cabin, glancing back at the aisle where everything had begun, where his son had nearly been lost, where fear had ruled, and where he had chosen to fight instead of flee. His jaw tightened. His breath was steady now. He would not allow this to be buried under press releases and legal jargon. Justice would come, not just for him and Kalen, but for every soul on that plane who had sat frozen in fear, too afraid to rise. As his foot touched the emergency slide and the night air met his bloodied skin, the storm of sirens rising in the background, Adrian whispered quietly, "This isn't over." The wheels touched ground, but the echoes of battle clung to every breath. News spreads like wildfire. The moment Adrian Miles steps through the hospital's emergency entrance, a wall of flashing cameras and shouted questions greets him like a second assault. He winces, not just from the burns on his arm or the stitched cut along his jawline, but from the sudden glare and chaos. Paramedics part the crowd with firm shoulders and firm words, but the press surges forward, hungry for footage, for a soundbite, for a glimpse of the man at the center of the most talked-about flight in the world. "Mr. Miles, is it true you killed the flight attendant? Was your child injured? Are you planning to sue the airline?" He doesn't answer. Not because he doesn't have words, he has plenty, but because he knows they'll be twisted, clipped into half-truths for headlines. Instead, Adrian keeps his eyes on his infant son, swaddled in a medic's arms beside him. Kalen stirs softly, unaware of the storm swirling outside the building and beyond. Inside, the hospital smells of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, probably blood. Adrian is ushered into a private room under security watch, per the airline's request, though the irony nearly makes him laugh. He sits in silence as a nurse tends to his wounds, taping gauze along his ribs where bruises are beginning to bloom like ink beneath the skin. A TV mounted in the corner is tuned to the news. The anchor's voice is calm, clinical, detached. Crestvale Airways has released an official statement regarding the mid-air incident aboard Flight 717. The company claims the situation was a tragic misunderstanding caused by stress at altitude, and that the crew's actions were within emergency protocol. Adrian's hands curl into fists on the hospital bed. "Misunderstanding?" he mutters, voice tight, eyes locked on the screen. "They call what he did a misunderstanding?" The nurse glances over, uneasy, but says nothing. Adrian breathes slowly, steadying himself. He knows exactly what the airline is doing, minimizing the damage, shielding their image, and most importantly, avoiding liability. He's seen it before in boardrooms. When bad decisions surface, companies sacrifice individuals and Polish narratives. But this time, Adrian isn't letting them control the story. His phone vibrates on the side table. The screen lights up with an unknown number. He hesitates, then answers. "You have a child," a distorted voice says. "You'd be smart to think twice before dragging this into court." Adrian stiffens. "Who is this?" Silence. Then the line clicks dead. He stares at the screen, rage and dread swirling in his chest. His instinct is to call security, to report it immediately, but something holds him back. He's not dealing with just one deranged man anymore. He's touching a system that has teeth. A knock at the door breaks the silence. A man in his late 30s steps in, shoulders hunched slightly as if unused to attention. He wears a simple button-down shirt and carries an old, scuffed laptop bag. I'm sorry to disturb you," he says softly. "My name's Merrick." Merrick Dorn. "I was on your flight, Adrian's guard lifts. Are you okay?" Merrick nods, stepping forward slowly. "I recorded something. I didn't know what to do with it, but I couldn't stay quiet after hearing that broadcast." He opens the laptop and plays the video. The screen comes alive with chaos. Nolan lunging, Adrian fighting back, the cabin window cracking, and finally, Adrian shielding his son from the spray of glass. Gasps from passengers, shouts for help, the sound of violence no one could misinterpret. It's all there. Adrian watches in silence, jaw clenched, eyes wet with fury and gratitude. When the video ends, Merrick quietly slides the laptop across the bed. "You can use it. However you want. Just make sure they don't bury the truth." Adrian grips Merrick's hand with quiet force. "Thank you. You just changed everything." Hours later, the footage hits the internet. Uploaded anonymously, it's first picked up by small news sites, but within minutes it explodes across social media. Headlines multiply like wildfire. Footage reveals shocking mid-air assault, passenger saves child as crew fails to intervene, CEO Adrian Miles fights off deranged flight attendant in viral video. Crestvale under fire. Hidden violence at 30,000 feet. The airline's carefully constructed statement collapses. Public outrage surges as the footage reaches millions. Comment sections erupt with fury. The public sees not just a father protecting his child, but a man betrayed by a system meant to protect passengers. But with visibility comes danger. Adrian's phone fills with new messages. Some are of support. Others are veiled threats. "You should have kept quiet. You're making enemies. Leave it alone or risk everything." Adrian deletes none of them. He reads each one, memorizes the tone. He knows fear is the weapon they use to keep people silent. But he also remembers what he saw in Nolan's eyes. Not just rage, but something darker, like he was following orders or acting on a belief bigger than himself. "This wasn't random," Adrian mutters to himself. Later that night, lying beside Kaylin's crib in the hospital room, he stares at the ceiling, mind racing. His thoughts return to Nolan's words mid-fight. Pampered executives who think they own the sky. There had been venom in the words, but also certainty. Not just hate, purpose. That certainty now haunts Adrian more than the violence. Merrick's video had pulled back the curtain, but what else waited behind it? Adrian glances down at his son's sleeping face, innocent and untouched by the nightmare they just survived. His jaw sets with quiet determination. He won't be intimidated. He won't disappear. If they think fear will silence him, they don't know what kind of father he is. The battle in the sky was only the first crack in a hidden wall. The courtroom lights were stark and unforgiving, casting long shadows on the polished floor as Adrian Miles stepped onto the witness stand. The room was packed, reporters filled the back rows, fingers hovering over keyboards, and camera lenses peeked discreetly through the glass doors. The air buzzed with anticipation. This was not just another lawsuit. It had become a national spectacle, a clash between one grieving father and an airline corporation desperate to protect its name. Adrian met the eyes of Crestvale's lead attorney, Malcolm Greaves, a silver-haired man with an impenetrable expression and a voice smooth as glass. Greaves rose slowly from his seat, buttoning his jacket with the kind of practiced grace that came from years of courtroom dominance. He approached Adrian with deliberate steps, carrying a stack of neatly organized folders, each labeled and color-coded. "Mr. Miles," Greaves began, his tone calm but pointed, "you understand that this court is here to determine the facts, not feelings or speculation." Adrian didn't flinch. "I understand perfectly." Greaves lifted a document from the stack and held it up for the court. "According to this passenger report from a previous flight, Mr. Nolan Veyer had no documented behavioral issues. Isn't it possible that what happened on your flight was simply a one-time failure in judgment, an unfortunate outburst under stress?" Adrian leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "No, it wasn't a failure in judgment. It was the result of a culture that allowed him to act without fear of consequence." Greaves narrowed his eyes, shifting to a second document. "But there's no formal record, Mr. Miles. No file in the airline's database that shows—" "That's because they buried it," Adrian interrupted, his tone sharper now. "Or ignored it, but that doesn't mean the danger wasn't real." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. From the gallery, Elias Thorne, Adrian's attorney, slowly stood. With a nod from the judge, he approached the bench and held up a flash drive. "If I may, Your Honor, this contains footage recorded by a passenger, Merrick Dorn. It captures the entire altercation." The judge, a stern figure named Justice Harlan Merrick, gave a curt nod. The video was queued up and played on the large screen to the side of the courtroom. Gasps filled the air as the footage unfolded. Nolan's hands wrenching the infant from Adrian's arms, the shattering glass, the brutal fight. Every detail was there, unfiltered, undeniable. When the lights came back on, the room sat in stunned silence. Elias stepped forward again. "This is not the story of one man losing control. This is about a system that protected him, ignored complaints, dismissed warning signs, and gambled with passenger safety." He paced slowly before the jury. "And we have more than video. We have internal emails from a Crestvale employee who wishes to remain anonymous, emails that show Nolan's name appeared in passenger complaints at least 7 times. All were marked 'No action required' by Crestvale supervisors." He placed a stack of printed pages onto the evidence table. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, but said nothing. Adrian studied the jury. Some looked horrified, others angry, but all were listening. He stood from the witness stand. "This isn't about revenge. I don't want their money. I want to make sure that no father, no child, ever faces what we did." A murmur of approval rose from the spectators. Greaves quickly stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is turning into a personal plea." Justice Merrick raised a hand. "Overruled. Mr. Miles has the floor." Adrian turned to the judge. "Crestvale's lawyers offered me a settlement last week, a large one, enough to stay quiet for a very long time." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "But I said no," he continued, "because no amount of money can replace the safety of a child." The courtroom held its breath. Elias nodded slowly, knowing this moment would define the case. The law would decide, but Adrian's will had already carved its verdict in stone. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as the judge's final words echoed through the chamber. "Crestvale Airways is hereby found negligent and is ordered to pay compensatory and punitive damages. The airline is further required to implement comprehensive reforms, including the establishment of an independent oversight board." The gavel struck with a hollow finality. Adrian Miles didn't flinch. He stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, jaw clenched, the weight of the months-long legal war pressing into his spine like invisible armor. The lawyers beside him exchanged quiet congratulations, but Adrian's eyes were fixed on the airline's executives seated across the room, men who had tried to bury the truth beneath public statements and private threats. Now they shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor, their tailored suits doing little to hide their shame. The judge continued, voice firm and unyielding. "Mr. Miles will serve as the inaugural chairman of the Oversight Board. It is this court's belief that someone who has endured such extraordinary circumstances and remained steadfast in the pursuit of justice is uniquely suited to lead meaningful change." Adrian didn't move, but inside something stirred, a quiet ripple of closure. He had entered this courtroom as a father who'd fought to protect his son midair. Now he walked out as a man who had changed an industry. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters surged forward with microphones and questions, but Adrian said nothing. He kept Kalen's photograph tucked safely in the inside pocket of his suit, right above his heart. He didn't need to speak, not yet. The verdict had spoken for him. Months passed. Adrian stood at the glass observation deck of Hanover International Airport, overlooking the bustling terminals. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights, and the scent of coffee and jet fuel lingered in the air. He held Kalen in his arms, the boy now a few months older, curious eyes watching the moving walkways below. Adrian's steps were slow, deliberate, not like a man rushing for departure, but like one returning home from a war that had finally ended. Inside a nearby training room enclosed in thick glass, a group of fresh-faced flight attendants sat in navy blue uniforms. A tall male instructor stood at the front gesturing to a digital screen. The words on the slide read, Passenger Dignity and Crisis De-Escalation. Module 3, The Skyloom Incident. Adrian's throat tightened slightly at the sight of the title. One of the trainees raised his hand. Sir, is it true the baby almost fell out through the window? The instructor nodded solemnly. Yes, the cabin's integrity was nearly compromised, but the child survived because his father risked everything to protect him. That man now chairs the very board ensuring none of you ever face such a situation without training, empathy, and accountability. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, abuse of power, and the violent consequences of unchecked cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke reflection on accountability in positions of trust, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and protection for all.